the worst marathon in Olympic history. Of all the Olympic Games ever held, there's one that keeps coming up as the worst: the 1904 Games in St. Louis. But here's the kicker: it wasn't just bad luck. This disaster was orchestrated. And to understand how, you need to start with one simple fact. At the 1904 Olympics, the Olympics weren't even the main event. They were a last-minute sideshow. The real star was the St. Louis World's Fair, this massive, dazzling celebration of America's Louisiana Purchase. It was the place to be. And the Olympic movement, still trying to find its feet, got completely run over. The International Olympic Committee had awarded the Games to Chicago, but the massive St. Louis World's Fair was scheduled for the same year. The St. Louis organizers, led by James Sullivan, weren't worried. They were strategic. They held a powerful belief: hosting two major international events so close together would cannibalize them both. And they held all the cards. Sullivan was the key. He wasn't just a fair organizer. He wore two hats of immense power. He was the director of the fair's Department of Physical Culture, and crucially, the head of the Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, which governed American amateur athletics. He used that power. He worked to move the AAU's national championships to the World's Fair. This simple maneuver guaranteed that America's best athletes would be in St. Louis, not Chicago. The threat was clear. St. Louis would stage its own world-class athletic festival that would utterly overshadow the fledgling Olympic Games. Facing this coordinated pressure, and with President Theodore Roosevelt leaning on the side of the fair, the IOC's founder, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, was backed into a corner. He surrendered, agreeing to move the Games to St. Louis. He was so disillusioned he refused to attend, later stating the Games matched the mediocrity of that city. So the Games were moved, but in St. Louis they weren't just relocated, they were swallowed whole by a giant. The fair was the main event. Its sprawling Ivory City was already built. 20 million visitors were already expected. The Olympic Games, by comparison, were a tiny, unproven addition. With Coubertin gone and the fair in charge, the path of least resistance was clear. There was no separate Olympic plan, because there didn't need to be. The venues were the fair's venues. The schedule was the fair's schedule. The Olympics were simply slotted in as another attraction. In fact, the line between fair and games was blurred on purpose. Organizers labeled almost every athletic event at the fair as Olympic, creating a chaotic 146-day sports festival that was impossible to distinguish from the rest of the exposition. The core Olympic competitions were lost in the noise, and who could afford to get there to compete? Getting to St. Louis was a prohibitive, multi-week journey by steamship and train. For most international athletes, the cost and time were simply impossible. The result was as predictable as it was lopsided. Of the roughly 650 athletes, over 500 were American. This wasn't a World Games. It was, for all intents and purposes, an American national tournament held on the grounds of a World's Fair. America won a staggering 239 medals, the most dominant performance in Olympic history. But it's not a record of athletic supremacy. It's the record of a global event that, by design and circumstance, the rest of the world couldn't reach. But for James Sullivan, the entire Olympic program wasn't just a neglected sideshow. It was an opportunity to test an idea.
Sullivan was a true believer in a dangerous piece of sports science called purposeful dehydration. The theory claimed that drinking water during a long race wasn't just unnecessary, it was bad for you. It would make you weak or sick.
Now it's important to understand, early marathons were chaotic. There were no official rules. In 1896 and 1900, organizers didn't provide water. Runners had to find their own, and they almost always started in the blistering afternoon heat to serve as a dramatic stadium finale. The 1900 Paris Marathon was run in a scorching 102 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than St. Louis. So why is 1904 considered uniquely terrible?
Because of intent. In Paris, the heat was the result of poor planning by a clueless committee. In St. Louis, the suffering was deliberately engineered. Sullivan saw the Olympic marathon not as a sporting event, but as a controlled laboratory. He intentionally restricted water to a single station over the entire 24.85 miles. This wasn't an oversight. This was the experiment.
And the course was the perfect, neglectful companion to his test. With no standards to follow, they just plotted a route into the Missouri countryside. Unpaved roads, 7 huge hills, all left open to traffic. Runners would have to dodge wagons, streetcars, and trains. The dust they kicked up would be a key part of the ordeal. And so, in the furnace-like heat of a Missouri afternoon, 32 men lined up. Before them, 24.85 miles of dust, hills, and traffic. Inside them, an Olympic dream. They were his unwitting test subjects. Who were these 32 men? They weren't just names on a roster. They were a collection of some of the most unlikely Olympians you could imagine, each with their own story, about to collide with Sullivan's experiment. First, the contenders. The man to beat was Thomas Hicks, the stoic American marathon champion. His strategy didn't just rely on training, it relied on a support car trailing him, stocked with a dangerous scientific remedy for exhaustion. Then there was Fred Lors, a talented bricklayer from New York. A strong amateur, he was there hoping to shock the establishment and make a name for himself. But the field was filled with true wildcards, like Felix Carvajal, a charismatic Cuban postman. To even get to the start line, he'd lost all his money gambling in New Orleans and literally begged his way to St. Louis. He arrived just in time wearing a long-sleeved shirt, heavy trousers, and street shoes. A spectator, or maybe a policeman, took pity and cut his pants into makeshift shorts. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He was starving before the gun even went off. And then there were Len Tognan and John Masciani. They were about to make history as the first black Africans to compete in the modern Olympics. But they weren't invited as athletes. They were in St. Louis as part of a Boer War reenactment at the fair, paid performers in a living exhibit. Their real job, however, made them uniquely formidable. They were message runners, famed for their legendary endurance across the South African plains. Someone saw them and said, "You should run." So they did, barefoot. They were joined by other strong runners like William Garcia, a top contender from California, and Sam Meller, another experienced American marathoner. On paper, they were all ready for a tough race, but the race waiting for them wasn't on paper. It was in Sullivan's laboratory, and none of them were ready for what it would demand. At 3:03 p.m. on August 30th, the starting pistol fired. The 1904 Olympic Marathon was underway. Immediately, 90-degree heat and a suffocating cloud of dust, churned up by the runners and the officials' cars, enveloped them. What followed wasn't one race, but a series of desperate personal ordeals. For William Garcia, the killer was the air itself. The dense clouds of dust didn't just choke him. With every gasping breath, he was swallowing abrasive particles that sanded down his throat and stomach lining. He ran on, feeling a pain deeper than exhaustion, until he could run no more. He collapsed, unconscious, by the roadside. He wouldn't be found for hours. Doctors later said he was within a mile of a fatal hemorrhage. The course had claimed its first casualty before the race was even half over. While Garcia suffocated, Felix Carvajal was having the time of his life. Starving, he spotted a spectator with peaches. When they refused to share, he simply snatched them and ran. Later, raiding an orchard, he ate apples that turned out to be rotten. The crippling cramps forced him to stop and take a nap under a tree. For him, it was a chaotic adventure. And for Len Tognan, the adventure turned surreal. As the barefoot runner paced along, a pack of wild dogs burst from a farm and chased him nearly a mile off course. The Olympic marathon had just become an obstacle course. But for the man in front, Thomas Hicks, the greatest threat was in his own support car. As America's top hope, Hicks had a dedicated car with handlers, who were also race officials. The rules allowed assistance, and when Hicks, dehydrated and delirious, began to collapse, they administered their aid.
They used strychnine, rat poison, mixed with egg white. At the time, it was considered a reviver. In small doses, it blocks the nervous system's fatigue signals, artificially boosting stamina. But the side effects are brutal: muscle locking, overheating, and a terrifyingly thin line between a stimulant dose and a lethal one. This was, effectively, the first recorded doping incident in the modern Olympics.
The poison delivered a jolt of chemical defiance. Hicks's muscles, screaming to stop, locked into a painful, rigid stride. He was moving again, but with a sickening artificial force. His skin turned ashen, and then he saw something that shattered his will. He saw Fred Lors. Lors, the bricklayer, had quit with cramps at mile 9, and then hitched an 11-mile ride in an official's car. When the car broke down, he felt miraculously fresh. He started running again, and near the 20-mile mark, breezed right past the poisoned, staggering Hicks. For Fred Lors, the race had become a prank. He entered the stadium to a roaring, relieved crowd. He was hailed as the American victor. Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter, was moments from placing the laurel wreath on his head, until a shout rang out, "He's a fraud! He rode in a car!" The celebration died. Confronted, Lors claimed it had all been a joke, telling reporters he never intended to keep the medal. The crowd's cheers curdled into a torrent of boos. He was stripped of his glory and banned for life by the AAU. The marathon had its villain, but it still didn't have a true winner, because the real race was still finishing. Back on the road, Thomas Hicks was dying in the lead. Desperate, his handlers gave him a second dose of strychnine and egg whites, washed down with brandy. Charles Lucas, the official riding with him, recorded what happened next. He wrote,
Hicks ran mechanically, like a well-oiled piece of machinery. His eyes were dull, lusterless. The ashen color of his face and skin had deepened. His arms appeared as weights well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, while his knees were almost stiff.
Hicks began to hallucinate, convinced the finish line was still 20 miles away. In the last mile, he begged to lie down. He was given more brandy instead. His run had become a shamble, his victory lap a farce. So, to complete Sullivan's experiment, his trainers simply carried him. They held him aloft over the final few yards, his feet twitching in a ghostly pantomime of running. Thomas Hicks crossed the line a casualty, presented as a champion. His time, 3 hours, 28 minutes, 53 seconds. The slowest winning time in Olympic history, a record not of speed, but of sheer survival. Only 14 of the 32 starters finished. The 1904 Olympic marathon was over. In the wreckage, each man carried the race with him. Thomas Hicks, the winner, had lost 8 pounds. When he could finally talk, he said,
"Never in my life have I run such a tough course. The terrific hills simply tear a man to pieces."
But his story didn't end in St. Louis. Showing incredible resilience, he kept running, and in a stunning twist of fate, he placed second in the Boston Marathon the very next year. Fred Lors, the fraud, was banned for life by the AAU, but that ban was lifted, and in an even more perfect twist, he went to Boston the following year too, and won it outright. The man who crossed the line first as a fraud proved he could do it for real. Felix Carvajal somehow finished fourth in St. Louis. His story got weirder. He got sponsorship for a race in Athens in 1906, then vanished. Cuban papers declared him dead. A year later, he showed up in Havana, fine, with no explanation. Len Tagnan and John Masciani made history just by finishing. Tagnan came in 9th, Masciani 12th, a huge testament to the endurance that brought them there. But beyond the personal stories was one grim fact. James Sullivan's experiment was a total catastrophe. He called the marathon indefensible on any ground but historic, and almost got it banned from the Olympics forever. The fallout from St. Louis did more than cause shame. It changed the sport. The horrific images from that day forced a reckoning. The modern marathon, with its standardized rules, frequent water stations, and real medical oversight, was built because of 1904. Sullivan's disaster ironically made running safe. But here's the final unbelievable twist. The man who engineered the worst marathon wasn't fired. He was rewarded. For organizing the 1904 Games, the International Olympic Committee gave James Sullivan a Special Olympic Medal, the only one ever awarded to an American. And in 1909, he wrote a book, the title, Marathon Running. In it, he looked back on the wreckage and doubled down. He wrote,
"Don't get into the habit of drinking and eating in a marathon race. It is not beneficial."
The architect of the disaster had learned nothing. The man who nearly killed athletes by denying them water was still giving the same deadly advice. That's the real lesson of the 1904 marathon. It's not just a story about old-timey craziness. It's about how real progress has to fight not just ignorance, but the powerful people who refuse to admit they were wrong, even with the evidence right in front of them. It was the worst marathon in Olympic history. And it was a race we desperately needed to happen, so it would never, ever happen again. That battle between human ingenuity and the catastrophic cost of human stubbornness has many chapters. In our next episode, we travel from the dust of Missouri to the streets of Boston in 1919, where another experiment in speed and pressure would fail with devastating consequences. It was called the Great Molasses Flood, and its story of ignored warnings and a sugary, suffocating tide is one of the strangest disasters in American history. From a poisoned marathon to a killer molasses flood, these are untold chronicles. What's the next chapter you want us to uncover? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the story they didn't teach you.